Stars
Podcast. This is the
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
Well, I certainly had an interesting weekend after having watched the Scott Hall documentary. That was something else. And I'm glad I did watch it because after the wrestling I watched this weekend, the documentary was about the only real top-notch thing in the wrestling market that I actually got an enjoyment out of. Certainly more eventful than Rampage and Power, that's for sure. Welcome and thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Five Starr Wrestling Report podcast here on Rumble and YouTube each Monday and Friday to bring you wrestling recaps and discussions all the way from classic content dating back to 1983 up to the modern garbage of 2022. Getting the full gamut and perspective of someone that's watched professional wrestling through the good, the bad, and the ugly. Before we get into today's content, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell if you have not done so already. Make sure to like the show for me and leave a comment to share your feedback on any and all topics we talk about today. Especially would like to hear some feedback when it comes to your perspectives on Scott Hall. I know he's a controversial figure in the wrestling business, and while I touched on him on the Friday show to share some personal memories of him as a performer, I think the documentary that we discussed at the end will give me a little bit more time to elaborate more on his career. But I do want to kind of get a perspective on where people line up with Scott Hall, especially in the scope of wrestling history. You a fan? Not a fan? Does he rank up there as an all-time great for you? Somewhere in the middle? Let me know. And before we get to the real meat of the show today, let us very fleetingly talk about some wrestling that I watched this weekend, particularly NWA Power into AEW Rampage. And this is going to be the 30-second Rampage recap. You're getting the Cliff's Notes rundown this week because, quite frankly, I don't want to spend any more time talking about this show than it deserves. With minimal effort on their part comes minimal review effort on my part. Darby Allin beat the Butcher by countout in a perfectly fine match that maybe could have been better if we were given any reason to care about the Butcher. Or anyone in Andrade's job faction for that matter. Layla Hirsch wrestled Red Velvet. And you can put two and two together and figure out how well that one went over. The House of Black versus Fuego del Sol in Bear Country was pure garbage. And Keith Lee versus Max Caster was too long. Keith sold for too long. And once they did the post-match angle with Swerve Strickland running down to make the save for Keith, I immediately knew where Keith's career was doomed for in AEW. Career mid-carder. Also, I noted a lot of black-on-black action going on in that last segment there. So I'm sure all the BLM activists will start bitching up a storm about that on social media. Did I do well? Was that 30 seconds or somewhere close to it? Hopefully I did it justice. With TV shows that produce little to no effort comes a recap with little to no effort. And again, yes, I know about the NCAA games, and I know they got a bullshit time slot they were dealing with on Friday night. But at that point, it's like, why even bother airing a show? Especially if your matches are going to be as underwhelming as these ones were. At that point, you may as well just be better off airing a Best of Rampage edition. And that'll take us to this week's NWA Power episode, which wasn't a whole lot more noteworthy than Rampage, but most of the show was all centered around the Crockett Cup seedings. They ended up announcing all of the seeds for the Crockett Cup event, the first 8 of which were introduced in Seg 1. At number 1, we had La Rebellion. Number 2, the Briscoe Brothers. So it's good to know at least one wrestling company hasn't hashtag canceled the Briscoes for questionable tweets that happened over 10 fucking years ago. God, people on social media are just the worst. Anything to ruin people's lives. Keyboard warriors and radical social justice leftists. They will do anything to take anyone down at a whim. Number 3, OGK, who, as we know from their match with the Fixers, they ended up getting eliminated from the tournament in the first round match a couple weeks back. In one of the funniest botches I've seen on NWA programming thus far, they announced that because Nick Aldis is wrestling Matt Cardona for the world title, Doug Williams was going to have to find a replacement partner for the Crockett Cup. So Billy Corgan announces that it's going to be a mystery partner. And meanwhile, when they put the graphics on screen for the brackets, we clearly see the names Williams and Smith. So either Smith is a placeholder for the time being, or it's going to be David Hart Smith and Corgan just royally fucked up. Number 5, Strictly Business. Number 6, The Pope and Mims, which is definitely a dark horse pick for me. Love me some Pope. Mims is fucking awesome. I don't expect them to go all that far, but I will be cheering those two on from the sidelines until they are eliminated from the tournament. Number 7, we have Kratos and Aaron Stevens, who apparently are still a thing in this company. And at number 8, Odinson and Pero of the End. And again, what I really liked about the way they conducted this portion of the program is that they didn't just announce the brackets and move on with the rest of the show shortly thereafter. They took the time to talk about the teams, Corgan Galley and Pat Kenny alike. They put over each team, how they earned their spot in the tournament, and they all tried to give each team some level of believability so that they weren't actively dismissing them from the equation immediately. That was really good. They broke that up with Sal Renaro versus some schlub named Jay Spade, and I didn't have a whole lot to say about it. Anything involving Sal on this show, I'm kind of tuned out. After watching him drink fake blood on the show about a month ago, I about tapped out on anything remotely involving credibility with that guy. That was followed with Billy Corgan and Joe Galley recapping the Cardona-Trevor World title match last week, and this was really good. The exact kind of thing a competent professional wrestling company does when they want matches to mean something of value. They take the time to recap the match. They talk about Trevor's current condition and him not being medically clear. They share their thoughts on Cardona winning the belt. They show some highlights of the match to keep it fresh in our mind after the fact. And they follow that up with hyping up Cardona's first title defense against Nick Aldis at the Crockett Cup and talk about the implications of what may happen afterwards. What happens if Cardona manages to knock off Trevor and Aldis in 2 straight back-to-back title defenses? Where does that put him in terms of credible top challengers after the fact? Again, it's not that fucking hard, but when you take the time to show highlights of important matches and take the time to talk about them in detail, it lets us know that what we saw mattered. It's how wrestling used to be done before all the moves marks got involved and started putting ring work above everything else because everyone's a fucking moron. I can't tell you how many times I talk about this with AEW, but this is the kind of shit they should be doing on Rampage every so often instead of puking out a bunch of low-rent indie matches with geeks that no one cares about. We had Misa Kate taking on Allison Kay, which was mostly just an enhancement match for Allison. Wasn't bad, but again, not a whole lot to say about it. Continuing along with the Crockett Cup seeds, at number 9, Hawks Aerie. Number 10, the Dirty Dildos. Yeah. Number 11, Mike Knox and VSK. Number 12, Jordan Clearwater and Marche Rocket of Idolmania Sports Management. Number 13, the Ill-Begotten / Naturals 2.0. Number 14, we had the Fixers. And 15 and 16, this wasn't entirely clear to me, but I think the way they explained it was that the last two spots were going to be decided in qualifying matches with some of the last-minute team submissions that didn't quite make the cut. Like I said, it was not explained well at all, but I guess the last two seeds, whichever teams those end up being, are slated to face Law Rebellion and the Briscoes in the opening round. So we'll see how that turns out. There was some really bad stuff in there with Joe Galley talking with the Fixers. And like, there's a happy medium between doing over-the-top goofy comedy and being so ridiculously over-the-top where it just exceeds funny and becomes cringe. The Beta Bucks, for example. The Fixers trying to be clowny goofballs on this show. This was cringe territory. Final match was Judas killing Jamie Stanley. And if I told you I was bored to tears, I would be understating it. But they at least close out with something good. They had Matt Cardona and Nick Aldis do a sit-down with Galley to cut promos on one another before their title match. And any of you that have ever heard Nick Aldis cut a promo before, I mean, you know how great that guy is at delivering passionate babyface promos. And this one was no different. Great stuff in there with him talking about the legacy of the NWA World Heavyweight title. And, you know, he sat on the sidelines when Cardona first showed up because he tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. And then he quickly found out that Cardona didn't stand for any of the traditions of the NWA. Basically, he's a grifter. And the fact that he's a world champion is a disgrace to all the great champs that have come before him. I love the little plugs in there about Aldis and Tim Storm being the guys that started the rebuilding of the NWA several years ago, while guys like Cardona were on the indie circuit placating to all the smarks. And when NWA started to really catch fire a couple years ago, it was at that point that everyone wanted to jump on the bandwagon and hitch themselves to Aldis' success. And of course, you know, Cardona did a solid retort back promo where he tried to play up the idea that the match needs a guest ref because he thinks that with the way things are right now, there's a conspiracy theory against him. A concerted effort to screw Cardona over and run him out of the NWA. And that is when he casually name drops the idea that the match needs a guest ref, which once they showed the graphic for the match, turns out that apparently there is going to be a guest ref. And his name? Jeff Jarrett. That's right. JEFFJARRETT. Jeff Jarrett. God, I love those old vignettes. No, of course, they never actually announced this beforehand. It's just kind of like, oh, look, surprise. Jarrett's going to be refereeing a world title match. Would have been nice if they maybe built up to that in some way. I will say, you know, production and editing on this show, it needs some work. Because whoever's in charge of piecing these shows together, they miss a lot of key details. Overall, though, I really enjoyed this little edition of PowerrrSurge. I mean, there really wasn't a whole lot to it overall. It was mostly a Crockett Cup hype show, and the matches were secondary, but that's okay. You know, I like how they spent time building up the key matches and talking about why they're significant. We got the full rundown of the Crockett Cup seeds with each team getting some discussion from the announcers. Like I've said a dozen or so times by now, wrestling does not need to be that hard. You don't have to hotshot a bunch of bullshit every week in order to construct a good wrestling program. You know, doing simple stuff like this makes all the difference in the world. Slowing things down, taking the time to thoroughly explain story direction and character development, talking up the important key segments and what we can expect down the road. It's good to know at least one wrestling company out there gets it. So, like I mentioned on the Friday show, WWE had been running a lot of featured content on Scott Hall with Peacock over the last week. And when I saw that the Living on a Razor's Edge documentary came up in the archive footage, I knew I hadn't watched it. And knowing that it would cover a lot of ground, I wanted to give it a go and see what I thought about the WWE rendered version of Scott Hall's life story. And I'll say this overall, it was a very insightful documentary. Obviously, it's going to come from a WWE-driven narrative, and that's to be expected. And there's a lot you have to take with a grain of salt when it comes to WWE featuring content. It's like watching any mainstream media outlet. You got your radical left-wing propagandists trying to spin their narrative, the CNNs, the MSNBCs of the world. And you got your Fox networks on the other side of the aisle, and of course they have their own agendas to push. And a lot of the time, the two sides to the same story argument really comes into play, where you kind of have to subjugate the biases and find the truth somewhere in the middle. So knowing this was told from a WWE perspective, there's probably going to be some qualms that I had here and there. Generally, I think they did a really nice job laying out a timeline of Scott's career from his time in the territories and really building up to the more heavier stuff toward the latter half, where they started deep diving into the alcohol and substance abuse problems. In terms of who they had there as part of the casting crew, pretty much everyone you'd figure would be involved, with Hall included. Obviously, you had guys like Hunter, Nash, Michaels, Waltman was there, Vince was there, and by God, man, not to already get off topic, but Jesus Christ, going back and looking at Vince McMahon as early back as 2016, comparing that to the visual of him in 2022. And yeah, Vince was definitely showing his age, even back in 2016, but at least he could still make out something resembling Vince's face. God, in 2022, it doesn't even look like the same person. DDP and Jake Roberts were part of the latter portion once they started getting into the rehab stuff, and that was nice. At first, I was actually surprised to see Eric Bischoff there, but, figuring that he had already been working for the company by that point as a booker and an agent, guess it shouldn't have been all that shocking. So I guess the best way to go about doing this would be to just kind of break things down by segments and do a little bit of analysis of each part. The first part, Hall was basically talking about how he first broke into the business and being inspired by Dusty Rhodes. He mentioned that by the time the 80s had rolled around, Hall was smart enough to understand that the wrestling business had started to evolve into being more about the larger-than-life personalities, the fame, the money, the girls, and growing up and watching guys like Dusty successfully portray that on television. And he basically knew from, I think he said the age of 8, that he knew he wanted to be a pro wrestler. And it didn't take that long for them to dive into the shooting incident at the nightclub in Orlando. And they never explicitly mentioned the date, but I believe the time frame we're looking at is right around 1983. And this is right when he moved to Florida, too. He'd been hooked up to work as a bouncer at a nightclub. He had gotten involved with one of the female strippers. And the story basically goes, guy finds out Hall's involved with his girl. He shows up in the parking lot one night to confront him. They get into a scuffle and start wrestling for the gun, which Hall tells us was a semi-automatic. And Hall ended up inadvertently shooting the guy point blank in the back of the head and killed him. And obviously he gets charged for second-degree murder. Charges end up getting dropped later once the evidence starts to circulate that it was self-defense. But it ended up gravely affecting Hall's mental health years after the fact. And I think this was right around the point where he started diving a little deeper into the self-perception of the character that he portrayed on television versus the real-life human being Scott Hall. And this was a confliction that he had for most of his life. And it was actually a major important part of the documentary. They would kind of revisit the story throughout the entire thing. Essentially, the story goes that As time went along, he really detested the man that he was out of the ring and behind closed doors, but professional wrestling had gave him that ability to step out from his own form of the real life human being just to be a personality separate from his human self. It's actually an extraordinary crucial element. And I think to what drove Scott to achieve the success that he ended up achieving in his early career. Like his ability to turn the switch on and off from the kayfabe versus the shoot Hall, it kind of reflected why the business was so important to him. And fast forwarding a little bit to his work with the AWA, this is where he met guys like Kurt Hennig and DDP. Hall would obviously go on to team with Hennig in the AWA. They became tag champions. And in essence, Hennig ended up being a crucial part for the early development of teaching Hall how to work. They didn't get too detailed on the significance of the pairing between the two, but because Hall was so green when he first broke into the business, like he needed the experienced worker to teach him the ropes and help him lay out matches. And because of the dynamic of both guys and the fact that Hennig was such a great worker, Hall was able to pick up so much from him by just watching him up close in person and having advice fed to him on a consistent basis while they were working matches. The thing they mostly centered around was Hennig getting Hall more settled in with hanging out after the shows. This is where Hall started diving into getting hooked on pills after the shows. Guys like Sean and Kurt, they would go to bars and nightclubs. Kind of became the nature of the beast for guys back in the day. You didn't have video game hangout sessions like all the geeks in the business today do. Back in the day, this is what the boys did after the shows. Being on the road and dealing with that stressful schedule all the time. Drinking wasn't out of the ordinary, and substance abuse usage wasn't all that uncommon either. And I want to stay on the topic of DDP for a minute here because this is a very important part of the documentary as well. Because Hall had admitted that he was really trying to get to work for Vince in the WWF by the early 90s, by 91, the AWA was gone. The territories had been blistered out entirely. That basically meant that Hall was left with two options, WWF or WCW. He talked about trying to call up Pat Patterson and see if he could get in touch for a tryout, and says after a year or so of trying and calling every day, he just couldn't manage to get through to anybody. And he was about ready to quit the business entirely, but he needed the money. His wife was about to have a kid. So he called up DDP, who obviously we know had been working for WCW by that point. And once Hall pitched the diamond stud gimmick, that was it. He was off to the races. Offered a contract, and there you go. This is a real interesting part, too, because Bischoff was in here talking about Hall's early run in WCW and why things didn't really work out for him in the first run. He had talked about them pairing up Hall and Nash as a team, but that didn't really sell well. Bischoff tried to pass it off as Hall not being motivated to be a top star, that he didn't really have the drive at that point because he was still missing something. I get where he was coming from with that, but I mostly chalk that up to being saddled with lame gimmicks. The Diamond Stud had done a lot of good for Hall in terms of giving him early inspirations for where he would end up taking the Razor Ramone character in the WWF. But Bischoff's right when he says that Hall wasn't positioned to be a top guy at first. And again, I don't know how much I buy that Hall wasn't motivated or didn't have the drive to be a top guy. I think that's Bischoff trying to put his own lame BS spin on the story, which he's known to do from time to time. But the early WCW run was the exact thing that Hall needed. Because once Hennig put in a good word for him in the WWF and he talked with Pat and Vince, Hall got that call back, and they were finally interested in bringing him in to debut the Razor Ramone character. Had some great footage in there, some of the early Razor promos from 92 when the character was first being introduced to TV. And this was actually a really insightful part too, because, when Hall had first signed with the company, the consensus was, well, he can wrestle well, but, they're not exactly sure what his personality is. What's the thing that makes Scott tick? So, of course, Vince and Hall start talking, and Hall name drops the fact that his favorite movie is Scarface. That was the perfect character for Hall to adopt and craft to be his own on television. And that was the real moment that Razor Ramon took off in the WWF. Great character. Kind of similar in a way to how I'd compared to debuting a character like The Undertaker in the early 90s. Again, you have to understand this contextually too, because by the point Hall had signed with the WWF, they were well into the cartoon character era where, as Hall had mentioned previously, the professional wrestling aspect of things was very trivial in comparison to the larger-than-life personalities. WWF had gone through a series of ups and downs with trying to debut characters throughout the late 80s, early 90s. Some of them stuck the landing, some of them flopped royally. But Hall was a talented enough worker where he was able to take Razor Ramon and not only was he able to implement that persona on television, but as we would basically see by the time he showed up on Nitro in 96, Scott Hall essentially had become Razor Ramon. It was a very weird, dual personality thing where Hall had spent so long crafting and being Razor Ramon on television, it almost became impossible for him to just throw all of that to the wayside when he showed up working for the competition. From the accent to the toothpick gimmick, the hair, the walk, the strut. It was still NWO Scott Hall, but there were still elements of Razor Ramon in there that just became extensions of his own personality. It's so wild to go back and think how hard guys worked to just protect gimmicks and stay in some semblance of kayfabe back in the day. While they were still in the realm of Razor and the WWF, obviously they were going to start diving into some of the more classic matches. They were going to start talking with the guys that Hall became close with. Obviously, we're talking about the Clique, for those of you that are not attuned to wrestling history. And I'll get to the Clique in a minute because, this is kind of where the WWE side of the story crept in, and you could tell they were deliberately leaving out some key details. But the match they ended up showing was the ladder match from WrestleMania 10 with him and Shawn. It's one that people closely associate with Hall in terms of one of his best career matches. I still think it ranks up there as one of the best WrestleMania matches of all time. Certainly probably the best single ladder match of all time. But kind of delving back into the Clique for a minute, this was the first part of the documentary that I really started raising some eyebrows. So they established that Hall had become close with Nash and Shawn, Hunter, X-Pac. Yeah. I keep wanting to say Shawn as in Sean Waltman, but then I keep forgetting about Shawn Michaels too. Obviously, the baggage of drugs and alcohol come into the fold. They all get hooked on, all the substances as a coping mechanism for being on the road. And they got into the whole issue with Hall and Nash feeling like they were at a financial plateau. Hall wanted more money. He felt like he was stuck in a specific spot, and Vince never had a vision of pushing him beyond the upper mid-card spot that he was already in. Which again, you go back and you understand the reality that Hall never was a world champion, and the fact that Vince probably never saw him as world champion material. You can definitely understand Hall's frustration with being stuck at the position he was at, especially when he felt like he had more to offer than what Vince was willing to give to him. I think the problem really boils down to the fact that, by the point that we're looking at this in Hall's career with his run with the WWF, this would have been 95, early 96. Hall had become very complacent. His personal problems were affecting his work ethic. I don't think Vince felt comfortable bearing the responsibility on Hall as a world champion, especially if he knew he couldn't always trust him to be clean. And there were other problems that factored into the fold. By 95, Vince had already kind of had his eggs in the Shawn Michaels basket. Nash had already been established as a top guy. Of course, you fast forward a year later when Steve Austin started to gain a little more traction and Vince saw some money to be had with him. And it really became a case of wrong place, wrong time for Hall. Had it been a couple years prior and Vince had saw that same drawing ability in Hall like he did with guys like Shawn or Brett or Austin, who knows, maybe things would have turned out differently for Hall and Vince would have gone all in with him. But While they're discussing the issues with Hall and Nash meeting up with Vince over pay, they immediately jump to both guys putting in their notices. And next thing we know, they're already airing the debut promo from Hall on the May 96 episode of Nitro. There was absolutely no mention of the curtain call incident on the same month in MSG. And I thought that was bizarre. And I know Vince and WWE have been very weird about mentioning the curtain call in any major capacity, almost like they try to memory hold the incident like it never happened. And I understand from their perspective, it was essentially the moment that forever killed kayfabe in wrestling. But that was a very head-scratching thing. Like, why would they deliberately leave something like that out? Especially when Hall was such a crucial part to that whole story. And they had touched on the issues with the guaranteed contracts and work ethics for the Halls and the Nashes and the Hogans of the world once they got to Nitro. I did want to note this because Bischoff said this with regards to the Hall promo in May of 96, and it's something that really can't be glossed over. This is important. He said that the promo Hall cut that night was one of the most important promos they ever did to get the ball rolling for the Monday Night Wars. Because had that promo flopped and Hall had just shown up as another guy from the opposition, the NWO would have never taken off to the degree that it did. So, when you go back in the time machine and you try to discern like greatest moments of the New World Order, I know people will probably go to Bash at the Beach 96 Fallout, the Hogan heel turn, and believe me, I don't want to take anything away from that because the Hogan heel turn was a monumental pivotal point for the Monday Night Wars. One of the most important moments in that entire story. But I think when you really analyze critical moments, I think you have to go back to that Hall promo in May of that same year. Without that promo, there was no leverage or direction for the NWO story. There was no initial challenge to Vince in the WWF. There were no outsiders, obviously, once Nash showed up a couple weeks later. And there was nothing for people to get emotionally invested in going forward. But, as we all know from history, the NWO story started to open up a whole other can of worms when it came to the boys at the top. And, they didn't shy away from explaining it in detail. Guaranteed contracts, high-paid salaries essentially gave no incentive for the Hogans and the Halls and the Nashes of the world to put in effort or work hard. They essentially had free reign to do whatever the fuck they wanted, and it ended up leading to a whole range of problems. Aside from the obvious company problems of burying potential rising stars and sucking the company dry financially. For Hall, the main issue was the alcohol, the substance abuse, the fact that his marriage was falling apart around that time, and he had grown to detest the real-life Scott Hall, and, whereas several years prior, he was able to put all that inner rage and hatred aside when he was being Razor Ramone on TV. By the late 90s, Hall just really couldn't find that balance between the TV personality versus the reality. And, I can tell you from personal experience with watching Scott Hall in the latter dying days of WCW, especially that 98 to 99 period, where they were deliberately exploiting his alcohol problems on television. They essentially turned him into a walking drunk stereotype. You follow Hall's life and you understand where he was coming from. It was really hard to watch, even as a kid. I was probably, maybe 14, 15 years old watching that when it all happened. I mean, I could even told you back then that it was bad TV. And by the time they jumped to the post-invasion era of WWF, so that would have been late 2001, early 2002, and that's when they started diving into the failed NWO reunion with Hall, Nash, and Hogan. And I really had to go back and think hard about how that whole thing went down because the whole NWO WWF run was absolute garbage for so many reasons beyond the fact that Hall just wasn't physically or mentally stable at that time. And of course, that means I have to start tearing into the whole garbage invasion era of WWF where Vince did everything in his power to kill the legacy of WCW in less than 6 months. And boy, did that ego-driven investment pay off in more ways than one. But, Vince was right when he just talked about the fact that it was never going to work from the onset. Fans were still too angry about the previous year. The fact that WCW went out of business and the thought of seeing the Outsiders in the NWO on WWF television, knowing that it was going to be given its own corporate spin and they were never really going to go all the way with it, it just made it impossible for people to care. The other problem too is that because it was run under Vince's operation, they knew that the NWO was not going to win. So what was the incentive for people to get invested into that? And of course, the only thing that people really wanted to see out of that whole deal was Hogan versus Austin at WrestleMania, but Austin was a dick, and he didn't want to work with Hogan. So instead we got the infamous Scott Hall versus Steve Austin match from WrestleMania 18, which was just awful in every manner imaginable. And not for lack of effort on either guy's part, but Hall was right here. He said it was just a match. There was no emotion, there was no passion, there was no real eagerness to see that go down. And they didn't touch on this, but it should be noted too that the Hall-Austin WrestleMania match, it was essentially Hall's big ride-off into the sunset. Obviously he'd be seen years later doing some work in other promotions. I think he had a brief run in TNA at one point in the late 2000s, and, of course that didn't last long. But in terms of like big screen performance and the bright lights, that match with Austin was Hall's big send-off. Afterwards, the NWO thing kind of fizzled out. Nash, I think, would stick around for a little bit before blowing out his quad in a TV match, and he was essentially gone. Sean Waltman was done shortly thereafter. Hogan ended up turning babyface after that match with The Rock, so, there goes your big NWO reunion, right? It's sad, man. It really is. Yeah, I think nostalgically, there was a part of the wrestling crowd that wanted to see that reunion for old time's sake, but, between the emotional stability of the guys involved, the stain of Vince's hostile treatment of the WCW and the garbage invasion angle, there was too much baggage there. Vince is right. It was never going to work. They touched on the plane ride from hell incident, which Hall essentially chalked up to he was out of it. He didn't remember a damn thing about it. Again, that was around the point where they had basically called up Hall and issued his release, and basically for the next 10 years or so, Hall would just sit at home. They touched on the domestic abuse charges, the numerous arrests between that 2002 to 2012 time frame. Really tough stuff to watch. The struggles with Hall going through the series of rehabs and most of them not working. They aired that really disturbing incident at that indie event in 2011 where Hall made the guest appearance and completely drugged out of his mind, saying he had a seizure that morning. Nash had talked about the fact that he watched what Hall was going through and basically got to a point where he just started wondering when the inevitable would happen. Probably one of the most emotional parts of the documentary was when they got into the DDP Jake Roberts part. Calling Hall on their phone at their home. Hall saying he's dying, saying he's been drinking vodka since that early morning. Again, man, really difficult stuff to watch. But they wanted to meet him at the airport because they want to help him. And all they did from the point that call ended to showing up at the airport was just hoping and praying that Hall would be there. And sure enough, he was there. Bloated in a wheelchair right on death's door. Completely immobile. But this is where they took us through the yoga workout routines and the slow road to recovery of Hall getting back on his feet with focusing on the balance and exercise. Really just another one of those circumstances where I grow to admire and appreciate Diamond Dallas that much more. Watching him in the ring growing up, I would never say he was one of my favorites or anything, but goddamn, he's such a good man. Just an extraordinary, down-to-earth, great human being who wants to help people better their lives. Watching him work with Hall and them showing the progression of Hall over time with regaining his balance and his strength, it's truly eye-opening. And I've seen similar things with this. I watched the DDP Joe Rogan podcast where they showed the footage of the really overweight guy taking the DDP yoga courses, being able to shed off all the excess fat. The exact thing that DDP was doing here with Hall. I know Rogan got really emotional after watching that time lapse of the guy basically regaining his health and being able to do all these incredibly flexible techniques with his body that no one thought was possible. All thanks to DDP, man. What can you say? He's a truly remarkable man, dedicated to what he does. They eventually got into trying to help Hall deal with the emotional toll of the parking lot incident at the strip club in '83. So they hooked up Hall with his counselor, who was able to convince him to go back to that same location years after the fact to reflect on it. Knowing it was going to be a challenge, Hall was reluctant to go back there, but he was able to muster up the strength to do it. He said he spent all that time trying to erase it from memory, and while he can't completely erase the guilt he feels over what happened, he understands that he didn't do anything wrong. It just, again, hard stuff to watch, but I'm glad they kept this in because it's one of those full circle stories that you watch develop throughout the documentary at the beginning, and when they take you back to location to the parking lot all those years later, watching Hall stand there, break down, and work through that emotional trauma of being able to reflect on what happened all those years prior. You really feel for the guy, and you empathize with what he went through. Because it's like, what happens if the tables were turned? What if Hall didn't live to see another day after that night? And of course, this all comes full circle once they get to the Hall of Fame ceremony for 2014. And tell you, man, even looking back at Hall around that point, post-rehab, entirely different person. There's that old cliche out there that you see a spark in someone's eyes when they're physically and mentally well. Watching that footage of Hall interact with everyone backstage prior to the ceremony and, him going out there to deliver that fantastic speech the night before Mania, that spark was there. That was a great moment. Of course, he had Nash and Hunter and both Shawns tearing up behind the scenes. It was a great reunion. And man, even especially looking at this through the lens of 2022, it's one of those circumstances where you just breathe a sigh of relief that Scott was able to have this moment, to be there in person for that induction. Physically, he was there. Emotionally, he was there. Mentally, he was there. He was happy. He was boisterous. He was just full of life and energy. And knowing Hall's history, it really hits home that much more knowing that Hall lived long enough to have an actual proper send-off from WWE. That good send-off where he was able to share the spotlight with his friends, give one final promo that felt like an old Razor Ramone promo. Being able to deliver that great final quote, "Hard work pays off. Dreams come true. Bad times don't last, but bad guys do." And everyone goes, "Yeah, Scott, yeah." It's a real-life triumph and tragedy story, but it's well told, even from a WWE narrative. Again, some parts here and there that were left untouched or maybe not expanded on as much as they could have, but in terms of an overarching timeline, I think they hit on just about everything they could. It's a very good documentary. And actually having Scott Hall there in person to film it, that gave it an extra bump that it really needed. And I've said this before when it comes to Scott. Grew up watching him on WWF and WCW. Probably wouldn't rank him among my top 15 or 20 favorites of all time, but he's someone that I really appreciated as a worker and a talent from a young age. And while it's easy to automatically scorn him for his tribulations and his misfortunes throughout his career in life, watching this documentary for the first time kind of gave me a perspective on why it's always better to hold out faith and hope in the ability for someone to improve their lives. Scott Hall is someone that, while I can't completely neglect the fact that he had a profound negative impact on some of the darker periods of the wrestling business, especially in WCW, I'm not going to ignore how much he meant to the business and the weight his contributions carry all these years later. Without Scott Hall, there's no New World Order, there's no long-standing Monday Night War ratings battle. History would have been written entirely different in the mid to late 90s during the, let's be honest, the last real hot period of the wrestling business before it completely tanked and fell off the cliff. Scott Hall was part of that. He was a front runner of that. And I don't think we can overlook that, nor do I think we should. So as we wrap things up for the show, I will highly encourage anyone that has not checked out this documentary, just go out of your way to see it. It's extremely informative, extremely well-produced, very emotional. No, I didn't cry for the record, but in terms of being able to see someone in a positive light and maintaining the ability to have the confidence in the human body to heal itself over time, whether that comes from physical or spiritual development or both, Scott Hall's documentary is a crucial watch. Really good stuff. So thanks for tuning in. We'll be back on Friday for the next podcast installment. Probably won't be as super stern and super serious as this one was, but it's all good. I'm sure AEW will leave me shaking my head and laughing at plenty of stupid shit by the time the show's over. Again, make sure to sub, comment, like the podcast. Hopefully I'll be doing more stuff like this in the future because, I enjoyed that documentary enough to maybe want to go back and dive into some more of that stuff when the time comes in the future. And again, I really would like to hear your guys' feedback on Scott Hall, or in general, if you watched that documentary, what you thought of it. Until Friday, take care all. Peace out.